Hello. So, day for discussions and questions. So I'm waiting for questions. Oh. About population dynamics in general, but more on the interaction things and so on. So, first question.
Is there a way to model the same carrying capacity for structured population?
So to model the, yeah, okay, if you have a, so let's start with what is a structured population, okay? So when do we actually all populations have structures, okay? For instance, take age, right? Now, when is it, so how would you model a population that age structure? We haven't done this, but say you have age structure and you classify your individuals of the population according to age classes. So let's say you have juveniles and you have adults and then you have elderly, okay? So then you would say my population now has n individuals which are juveniles. So I can write this way, or I can even do better. A population of juveniles, a population of adults, and a population of elderly. Right? And then I write down differential equations, and then I will have to somehow make people from the juveniles somehow get out of the juveniles and get into the adults, and then to the elderly and so on. Okay, so we won't do this now. That's just when is it interesting to make this division? Okay, so this depends on your system. Okay? For instance, if most important, a place where this is essential is in epidemiological models. That why? For instance, let's think COVID. So with COVID, the probability of having to go to the hospital and getting hospitalized it's much higher if you are elderly. Okay? So if I calculate the hospitalization rate for a whole population, okay, you can do it, okay, but this won't be useful for public policies because it's super heterogeneous. Okay, they're much higher according to the ages. Okay, and also sometimes very young people, I think, could also be important. That's, for instance, the case with influenza. Okay, models for influenza, who gets hospitalized due to influenza are very young people and very old people, not very old, but elderly. Okay, so in this case, your population you should divide your population according to ages and write down. You will have more equations, because you will have a function, there's a number of individuals that are in the class of juveniles, of adults, of elderly, and actually, for instance, there are models for COVID that we helped to develop and with a big group and so on, which have 20 age classes, and obviously, well, this has its own problems. For instance, if, for instance, in epidemiology models, what you have to have contact between somebody who is infectious with somebody who is susceptible. Okay, then you will say, okay, I have the susceptible juveniles, and then what's the contact rate between classes? This is a problem, yes? Because, for instance, people in the age of going to the school have much more contact with people of their own age than with, for instance, with very young people. Okay? So a person typically with 10 years old does not have much contact with newborns, so except obviously at home, but this is one contact. Okay? But and so on. Elderly have contact with which classes and so on. So that's a problem, and you have to have contact matrices, which is that should be made country by country, but it is not. For instance, I have a collaborator who is not from the exact sciences. She's professor at USP at the political science, but it's quantitative political science, and she wanted to do this kind of research, getting the actual contact classes, because this is important also in demography and other things. But well, she couldn't find money for that, because this is very expensive to do in field. Okay? So, okay. So this is, for instance, structure of age, but you could also have, in ecology, for instance, there are size. Okay? So, for instance, you can have a population which has a big, that happens a lot with fishes. You have, it is connected to age, but the important thing is size. And sometimes the big ones cannot be predated, and the small ones can. In order to understand the dynamics, you would have to divide your population between small and big. And then how, if the small is still growing, then somehow it will become big. You have to model this. So you have to get, you have to get you have to write models that take into account the classes. So this does not mean that you need to have structured models all the time. If, say, there's let's say a disease which has the same effect on adults and elderly, then why would you split in between adults and elderly? Or if you have a population that is predated and it's prey from some predator, and irrespective of the size, then you don't need the structure, because it's not important. It's a detail, but it's not important, okay, for the dynamics. So you have to have a knowledge which comes from, in ecology, I would say, from the field, or in epidemiology, come from knowledge of medical sciences, that what is important in order to answer your questions about the population dynamics. Okay? So now you asked about the carrying capacities. So in principle, there can be many things that can happen. Okay, so carrying capacities, you have models where you have a total carrying capacity. So what you get is terms like, say, okay, in this case it's not good, but let's say we have two classes, okay, big ones and small ones, and then you could have a carrying capacity like this. Okay, this is something that many people will do. This depends also on knowledge of the biological facts that are important. So what is the resource? Carrying capacity is always connected to resource. So if the resource is consumed more or less equally by the classes, then there's no point of having carrying capacities per class. But it could also be that in certain systems you have a carrying capacity for class 1 and a carrying capacity for class 2. So will depend. You can have carrying capacity separated for your structures and for your classes, or you could have carrying capacity total, only one. And then you get something like this. All the population divided by some carrying capacity, which is the total carrying capacity for all classes. So both of them. So again, this will depend on the particular system you are using and how the consumption of resources happens in the system. Yeah. More questions?
I just wondered, now that you were talking about different carrying capacities, I was wondering about some social insects and how the population of males is usually smaller than the population of females. Mm-hmm. And how would that, like, first of all, would that be important in the study of population dynamics? And second, if it is, how would I insert this into a model?
Okay, so here we are talking about sex structured, for instance, which is usually only two, although there are some protozoa and so on that have more than two sexes. Very, very nice. But so, what I never saw, for instance, people trying to model, for instance, social insects which have a different, it's not a sex ratio of 0.5, but what I saw, people do not separate males and females, probably because, depends on the question you are answering, then probably because, for instance, although they have usually different activities, maybe from the point of view of who predates them or the time life span, maybe they are very similar, and therefore you don't need it. Okay, but yeah, you can have population dynamics with males and females, and then you will have two functions, okay, f and n, say, and the birth rate will depend on the encounter between females and males, right? So it's not, this would not be something like, say, dm dt. It's not like r times m. Okay? It has to do usually with a term that accounts for encounters. The usual thing is then there's a constant, there's m times f divided by m plus f. Okay? So I can't even, I don't remember exactly why this is so, but you see, you have to have both. If you don't have males and females, then there's no birth. And the same thing here for females. Okay? So this kind of model can be interesting if something very different happens to males and females in the ecology of the project of the system. Okay, sometimes this happens. Males are, say, more predated, and then you should separate between the sexes. Otherwise, not. Okay, if everything is more or less everything which determines the population dynamics, say birth rates, death rates, predation rates, movements. If they are similar for males and females, then you don't need to make a problem, a model that has both. But if in certain systems it is very different, then you should do the separation of males and females. But then you have things like you need an encounter between males and females. So if the population of females is 0, then DMDT, well, there will be something for the death rate also. Okay, that's just the birth rate, and then there will be no birth because you need both males and females. So yeah, so that's it. I mean, I don't have completely in my mind exactly how these equations are written, but it's something like that. Okay, you need a term that is of this kind. This term it's a curious term because if you scale m and f by the same parameter, say I think f times some alpha and m times some alpha, then this would be alpha m, alpha, okay, this this alpha, right? Alpha squared here, but then alpha here, and then both sides scale in the same way. That's what you expect from usually when you have a term that is the birth rate. Okay? Usually it's linear, but if it's not linear, it's this kind of thing. But it's scales and same scale of sides. Okay? So, what else? Okay.
In one class, you mentioned that for microbe population for bacteria,
For
microbes for bacteria, the model would be slightly different from what I don't quite remember the one. So I was wondering, how can I create a model for microbial population, since they have like the lag phase, the log phase, then a plateau, and then they die, and how would that be different?
So many of the so depends more a little bit on what you are studying. If you are just studying total population, then it's pretty much the same as here. Okay, so remember E. coli. Well, it was an example of almost exponential growth and so on, and that's it. For models that for the total population, in this case, are pretty much the same. What is very different is when you take into account movement, because you can have different kinds of movement. Okay? For instance, you can have diffusion, which is just spreading out, like, okay. But you can also have chemotaxis, which is movement that goes along gradients of some subtract, okay. And this will be pretty much different. And chemotaxis is something connected to microbial world, okay? Which will be very different. And then, but this is connected to spatial aspects. We haven't discussed this because it requires the mathematical knowledge that is more advanced. But what I can remember well is that when you do spatial analysis with microbial, you can have aggregates, tendency to aggregate or not. And these kinds of things, that there's a high diversity of spatially, of movement and of aggregation and so on, which depends pretty much on the species you are studying. So the main, but if it's just one population or two populations, like we discussed yesterday, for instance, we had the paramecium and the didinium, if you just want to know the total population of them, then it's pretty much the same as if you have them. Yeah. Here.
When you were talking about the Lotica Volterra, you said that the functional response, the first functional response we were modeling was a Holland type 1.
Yes.
And there were 2 other Holland types.
Okay.
And I wonder, what are those?
Yeah, okay. Actually, yesterday we saw Holland type 2, but I just forgot to say that's the Holland type 2 functional response. So if you write, for instance, for the, that appears here, yes, so there's some, we had some R times V minus P times the functional response, which could depend on either V and P, okay? And then you have the other equations, but we can stay with this one, okay? The functional response, and again, this is the number of victims or of prey that is being consumed per unit time by one predator, okay? So Holland type 1 is F equal to alpha V. It's the linear one, okay? Which does not have satiation and or satiation or handling, okay? So just maybe make it a little bit clearer that yesterday we were talking about handling time, and sometimes I think I say that, well, it's related to satiation. So what handling time, it's not only strictly handling a prey. Handling time is also a concept that can be used for the time that it takes to digest, the time the individual will not go looking for prey. Okay? So handling time is a way, I mean, also to include satiation. Okay? So this was F alpha over V over 1 plus alpha times H times V. So, and then there's Holland type 3, but I don't know if I can remember exactly the form. It's, do I have this here? Should I have taken, yeah, it is some alpha V squared over some constant, beta, squared plus V squared. That's Holland type 3. But this is not, this one, both of them, okay, are called mechanistic. We derived actually this thing from hypothesis about how the individuals use their time. Okay, so this is the individual that does not have any handling time. It doesn't. It's not important. It's just like, for instance, like bacteria. Bacteria don't have handling time. Okay, so this is good for them. This functional response. This one is with handling time, and we derived it. This one is not mechanistic. It's just a function that is like this. Instead of having this function, okay, so if you could draw f in terms of v, and this is just like this. This one, f times v, is just this one, and this one is more logistic. Okay, so and it's not. I mean. I have very seldom we see Holland type 3 being used. Very. Okay. So most of the time, because sometimes what is important? What is important is that it does not grow forever, and it goes to some maximum value, okay, which is the maximum number of prey that can be consumed by a typical predator over time. So distinguishing this from this one is in practice usually not very useful because, well, unless you have very precise measurements. But most of the time, you don't. Okay? So people stick with this one. It's simpler, it's well studied, and this one, well, what you have, which is different, is sometimes, so these are the honing types. And they are meant to be pretty much general. Okay? So this is not applied for a certain species only. But when you study population dynamics of certain species, then sometimes you are even able to measure the functional response. If you can observe how many prey are consumed by a typical predator. Okay? So obviously, if you have a lot of predators and you have a lot of prey, you could obviously have predators that consume more than others. Okay, so you'd say this one consumes 3 per unit time, and this other one's only 1. Then there's a super strong guy that consumes 10. So you have a distribution actually. Okay, so what we are simplifying and saying that we just use, say, the average, and that's it. If you want to do more fine details, you should maybe have a distribution of handling times, in which case you will have a stochastic system, and this will be treated in a different way. And you want, if you have, for instance, a distribution for the handling time, then all variables, so this becomes a random number, which is following a certain distribution, and then everything is random, and then what you will calculate will be also the distributions of V, of P, everything, and then maybe you are interested more in the average, and you calculate the average, and so on. But you can measure, in principle, the functional response, and sometimes it's not any of them. So you write down a different functional response. I don't have any in mind, but there are papers of functional responses. They have super big numbers of. But they are particular to a certain system. Okay? So they are not any more general, and therefore we won't study this, because the idea here is that we will study things that can be pretty much general and then have the main concepts. You can have very complicated functional responses, and but they are more connected to particular systems. One functional response that is important, and it's not a Holling type, is when we study predator interference. So predator interference will give you a functional response that depends on P. You see, this is only dependent on V. So if predators have interference, if they have to fight between them and they spend time fighting, what you will get is a functional response which will be like alpha V over 1 plus alpha times the handling time, V plus alpha times a new time, that's G, okay, times P. G is the time that it takes to the individual is interfering with the others. So you divide the time by searching, handling, and interfering. So it's the typical time associated to interference or fighting with conspecifics. Yeah? So this gives you this kind of, that's called the Beddington. I don't know if 2 G's or I think it's only 1 G. Beddington De Angelis functional response. I didn't hear. So the predator, yeah, I mean, this is it's a interspecific thing, okay? So, and this is a very general thing. I mean, you can just put G equal to 0, then you get back to Hollin type 2, or maybe the interference is such an important thing that it's much more important than the handling. Then you put this equal to 0. You can play with it, okay? And so this is there's a paper that you should Google. It's called On the Nature of Predation, and it's written by a guy called Peter Abrams and another guy who is Ginsburg. I can't remember the first name of it. Okay, so Abrams, Ginsburg, On the Nature of Predation. That's a very curious thing. It's already 20 years old. But the point about this is, this guy Ginsburg, he has a theory about predation. That is that what he wants is that he postulated that predation should not depend on the functional response that we usually have, but should depend on the ratio between V and P. Okay? And Peter Abrams disagreed, and there were many people, many papers fighting each other. So then at the end, they decided to write down a paper jointly on what they agree and on what they don't agree. Okay? I think very civilized people. Okay, and this is on the nature of predation. Okay, so it's a short paper. It can be very interesting. You have all the elements to understand it. Okay? But well, they discuss also the Bennington De Angelis case, and so here you have interference and you have handling time. And you can take limits where one is more important than the other. Okay? But a particular limit that is also important is when the searching time is very small. So most of the time, the typical predator will spend handling and interfering. Okay? In this case, it's like these two constants are big. Therefore, you can these two terms may be much more important than this one. Okay? So in a limit, in this limit, you would have alpha times V times alpha times H times V plus alpha times G times P. Alpha can be cancelled. Okay? And then you divide both denominator and numerator by P. Then you have V over P divided by H V over P plus G. And this depends on the ratio of prey to predators. So this is a limit. That's the theory that Ginsburg actually had proposed earlier. That is called a ratio-dependent functional form. Yeah? So it depends on the ratio. And it can be taken as a limit of the Beddington-De Angelis system in when the main activities of the predator is handling and interfering and not searching. Okay? But this could be relevant when the number of prey is very abundant and it's very easy to find the number of prey. So you don't have to search much. Okay? So that's the thing. And well, what is particular about this functional response is that with this ratio-dependent functional response, you don't have the paradox of enrichment. Okay? Remember, the paradox of enrichment is you have a predator and a prey. The prey has a certain carrying capacity, and the carrying capacity depends on the richness of the environment for the prey. And we saw that if the carrying capacity was very high, you get cycles that go very close to zero. And usually this means that the system just collapses. I mean, population goes to zero, of prey goes to zero, and then the predator also goes to zero because it needs the prey. So with this, this does not exhibit the super big cycles, and therefore it doesn't have the paradox of enrichment, which is actually curious because it's not a paradox. Even yesterday we see at the end of the class that that with the Paramecium and Didinian, actually in this work from 1973, that they could actually see the paradox of enrichment in the sense that when there was a lot of food for Paramecium, which is actually bacteria, and the system had some cycles and then collapsed. But if you have less rich environment, they could see the cycles pretty much stable. Okay, so it's not a paradox. It's just a paradox in the sense that it's unexpected result that enriching an environment could lead to the extinction. You give more food and you have extinction. Okay? So this is and this happens, and people from agronomy, agronomical science know this, that you can have certain situations where you put too much fertilizers in a plantation, and which will sometimes lead to a collapse because of the having too much. Having growing the plants too much will attract too much pest, too much predators or consumers of the plant, which are usually insects and so on, and which could lead actually to the collapse of the system. So that's known. So paradox of enrichment is not a paradox. It's something that actually has consequences and practical consequences in different situations. So okay, so that's about the functional responses. So more questions? I'm waiting for questions. We have a lot of time to wait. You can think about the best question you want. Come on. Certainly you have something in your mind that is, yeah. Okay, there's one question. There's also a mic somewhere. Okay.
So yesterday, when we were talking about the Rosenweig-MacArthur model, we have seen that the model is dependent on the value of k. key. Sorry.
Yeah.
And if key is too small, eventually the oscillations get to a fixed point.
Yes.
Is that observable in like real life? If that author from the Gini when Parmesan tested that he would observe the fixed point in populations being stable.
Yes, not in the paper that we saw yesterday, because they were actually looking for oscillations.
Yeah.
Okay, they wanted to have an example of oscillations. But yes, most of these things can be better seen when you have a lab and microorganisms and so on. And all, not necessarily super microorganisms. There are a lot of things that are done with mites. Mites is acarus. And it's easy to manipulate them. And you have kind of arenas where they can have a predator-prey relations and so on and so on. And then you can also control, because in order to do an experiment with this, you have to control the input of nutrients for the prey. Okay? So you have to be able to have the situation in which the prey, in which the nutrient can be manipulated externally. Okay? And this is usually more often the case in laboratory experiments, because you can control. You need a controlling. And then, then you see, I remember have seen a paper with mites, for instance, where you had the stable situation, and you give more nutrients for the prey, then the stable the coexistence starts to have oscillations. Okay, so that is something that has been already for some time been seen. Okay? All of this is so these kinds of things, they are pretty much observable, and when you have these controlled situations, for instance, the mites, you have only two kinds, because you decided that you don't have a trophic network or a trophic web, and so you can do the experiments. And if you go to the field, this is much more difficult. Okay, so I gave you the example of an agricultural system, which is also a manipulated system. You have only one crop there. Okay? So you can do, although you may have a lot of predators, but sometimes it's just there's a one that's more important, and then you have I think that's very close to this. But well, most of the time in nature you are immersed in food webs. Okay? And then the questions that you will answer and that you will try to answer will be a little bit different. It's not anymore so much population biology. In ecology, it will be community ecology. And then you say that's community, let's say a trophic food web. Right? And then you can ask things like, okay, you have usually with trophic webs, you have levels. Okay, it's not like mutualism, for instance, is very different. And you have the basal species. And sometimes you can say, okay, if I enrich at a certain level, how will be the stability of the food web? Will there be populations that disappear, or will there be stability? So this is part of community ecology, and it's done not so much with these equations. You can do these equations, but it's a little bit different. Okay? So this is things that are, say, current research lines, for instance. And Actually, we have specialists on this kind of thing here, Flavia and Paulina. Paulina works with Stefano Lesina, who is one of the leading persons in community ecology, and he's a biologist, but he knows a lot of math, and they use things that are called community matrices, which is each line of the each column or each line is a certain species, and then you have a kind of interaction force between each of them. So I have a matrix, and then you run programs on the how you expect the time evolution of this, and what happens when you change the matrices. So it's simplified. It's not so much this kind of nonlinear density independence. People will look for more for linear models that represent somehow forces of interaction, say, for instance, predator-prey relations, or could also be mutualism or whatever, and or mixed things. And then you have the kind of dynamics of the community, and the main point is usually, is this dynamics stable? Are the number of species stable, or will there be extinctions? Under what conditions? If I put more food or less food, or if I take just one out, say something happened and a certain species was just taken out of the community, killed, somebody killed her. Will it have a trophic cascade? Will it have effects on up or down? And this is a question which is important. We have some kinds of trophic webs. Webs are usually a lot of things, but a lot of species. But you have also something which is called community moduli, which we will study next week, actually. And one of them is a trophic chain instead of being a trophic web. A trophic chain, which is top predator, mesopredator, and prey. So the prey is consumed by the mesopredator, and the top predator consumes this one. Eventually, this could also be, maybe this thing. Okay, variations of the problem. So this is, for instance, a community modulus, which is usually these things are immersed. These structures are immersed in a much larger food web, but sometimes they appear many times, and it is interesting to study this kind of thing. Okay, so the kind of question that you would pose here is, for instance, what happens if I take out, for instance, the top predator? Okay, so there are examples. Usually, are examples with systems that are in small islands. And it can be, that's not so much variability, and species cannot just find refugia somewhere. So they are good to study. And there's this famous thing that where this here is are birds, these are rats, and these are cats. Right? So if you take out the cat, then what can happen is that these will diminish a lot the population of birds. How does a rat prey on a bird? The eggs. Okay, so they can prey on the eggs. Okay, and they could actually, if they have an alternative source, but usually the rat has, they can take to extinction certain species of birds. And then what happens is usually, what is I think that actually is known and observed is that people introduced cats. Cats are super good predators. Okay, and sometimes they are really a problem actually, because I mean, we are talking feral cats, not the pets you have at home, okay? Which usually don't prey anything because they just get the food from you, but feral cats. So this introduction of the cat in a certain island had an effect of increasing the population of birds, because now the mesopredator, which is the intermediate guy, actually is regulated from here, and the population of this one cannot grow too much. And this gives you a release of the predation pressure on the birds. Okay, so this is there's a famous paper that's called "Cats That Protect Birds." Okay? Yeah. Because cats could also predate on the eggs, actually. Okay? But maybe it's not very important. Okay? And the main regulation of the bird population used to be the rat, actually. So this is the kind of questions related to food webs. Okay? Well, usually there's it's not only 3 species, but and then this kind of things like paradox of enrichment and so on is also studied, but in respect to the stability of the system, or the number of species that a certain food web has. For instance, that could be dependent on the resources that are at the base level. Okay? So there could be more or less species that can be sustained in a certain space. And you could also have, for instance, I put a lot of food at the base level, and then you have a kind of bifurcation, and it starts to oscillate. Certain species start to oscillate. And what is the effect that this will have on the whole food web? Okay, so these are questions that are still currently under investigation. People do a lot of work on this, actually. So I don't know who raised the hand first. Oh, you have it.
My question is about herbivory. I wonder how the predator-prey can model herbivory, because most of the time the predator doesn't kill the prey, and we have I don't know, the functional response would be different.
Yeah, that's okay. I mean, usually what people do in this case is consider that not the individual of the prey, of the grass or plant. They will consider only the part above the soil. Okay, for instance, biomass. Yeah, but with it is many times with herbivory. What happens is, and that we will actually see this in one of the next classes about consumer resource dynamics, is that the regeneration, the time, I mean, the typical time it takes, for instance, for the animal, say, to give birth and have the population dynamics going on, is at a certain time scale, and that's much slower than the time it takes to regenerate the plants. So you have a system which is called a 2-time scale system, which can be simplified. And one thing is, if this is actually the case, that it's like that you have the consumption, and the regeneration comes very quickly on in respect to the time it takes for the animal to reproduce and generate new offspring. So this has the effect of taking almost making the resource constant, because it generates so quickly then it's actually always coming back as a constant. Okay? And this, we will see, will have as an effect that the dynamics of these species, the consumer, is actually logistic. Okay? Because the resource dynamics is so quick that actually the dynamics of the resource is just, it's constant. Okay? It's being consumed and it's constant. Okay? Because if you look at the time scale of the consumer, this time scale is so much longer than the time scale of the resource that the resource is actually as if it were not being consumed. I mean, it's consumed, but it's not depleted. Okay. So, yeah, but yes, I mean, this is the typical thing that you have, say, with grass, for instance. Okay, it's very big. It's not all cases are like that, because you can also have plants that are not grass and so on, and then you could have something which is different. But yeah, usually people will talk about the plant as consider the plant only the part that is consumable and model this.
I think I have another question, because I remember you mentioned that when the predator is very smaller than the prey, we have a different kind of dynamics, and I don't remember how what changes. And I think that when you have a small herbivorous animal and a very large plant, it can behave.
Yeah, I can even remember why I told this. Actually, what was the context? The value of R or K. What? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. The efficiency. That was. Yeah. You can have, for instance, the parasitoid. It's the host may be larger than the parasitoid, and this will imply that you will have each host that it's consumed, it actually gives rise to more than one parasitoid. Okay? So this will give you a predator-prey dynamics where the efficiency of transforming prey into predators is bigger than 1. So you had to raise your hand, yeah?
There are actually 2 questions encapsulated in one. Does it make sense to say that the carrying, I know you mentioned something about it, but I'm not really clear, that the carrying capacity must be dependent on time? And if so, do interesting things happen, or is just, I don't know, a logistic, but it keeps, I don't know.
Yeah.
That's my general question.
So it can depend on time, and actually one of my master students that defended the thesis 2 years ago, actually it was an exercise about having a time-dependent carrying capacity or also time-dependent R, okay, making both of them and so on. But well, nothing very, very special happened in the case. For instance, if you have a carrying capacity that is periodic, simulating seasons, okay, and what you get is a population that instead of the population grows normally like this, and we'll just have something that is like this. Okay, not very funny, but there are things that with time-dependent parameters which are very interesting, and this is when you have like predator-prey dynamics, or also in epidemiology. In epidemiology, you have, for instance, you can have recurring epidemics, okay? because say you have susceptibles, infected, and removed. But say removed has only a certain time of immunity and goes back to susceptibles. So it's a replenishment of the pool of susceptibles, and therefore sometimes you have an epidemic, and then again, depending on the time it takes for the waning of the immunity. So you have some systems that have this kind of intrinsic cycles, like predator-prey dynamics. Okay, so predator-prey dynamics have intrinsic cycles also. Now, say now that this has been important in some studies of epidemiology of influenza, which has recurring epidemics, okay? And say one of the parameters of the system is time dependent and periodic. So you would have a system where you have an external periodic, an external period coming from external effects, and you have a period which is intrinsic to the system. And then you could have resonances. This is very nice. Resonances, I don't know if everybody knows what's a resonance. Usually it's like, for example, if I have a pendulum, and a pendulum has a certain frequency of the motion, and when I force this, okay, with the same frequency as the natural frequency, then it gives very large oscillation. Whereas if I don't force it with something else, which is not the multiples of the natural frequency, it will just have some erratic motion here, and it will be uninteresting. But if you have the same frequency, of natural frequency of your system, and force it with something which has the same frequency, that is easy to do with springs or with pendulums and so on, then you have a very large oscillation. And this can also happen in more complicated systems. And for instance, I know well this is an effect, and in epidemiology, where the external forcing could be close to the forcing of the natural oscillations of the system, and therefore you could enhance them and have a larger epidemics than you would expect, actually, by external forcing. Also, a disease where this can be important is cholera. Right? So cholera also has naturally oscillations. Yeah? And cholera is also many times dependent on seasonal things, because it depends many times on rainfall. Okay? So you have a certain frequency of rainfall. Usually, sometimes this can be changed to a higher or lower frequency due to activities of El Nino, and this changes, for instance, in India, the monsoon regime. And then sometimes you enhance cholera epidemics because the frequency of the rainfall season is different, and you have this kind of enhancement and have a stronger epidemic. And this is usually, well, this makes actually in India the dynamics. We have still cholera there, and this dynamics has a strong connection with El Nino, because El Nino changes the monsoon regime, and this can enhance through kind of resonance with the cholera epidemic. Okay. So this is a very nice. It's not very nice, but it's an explanation which is very interesting. That how to explain the relation that was known for that El Nino or El Niña have effects on the cholera dynamics. And actually the main model that's used for cholera was written by a Brazilian, like Claudia Codesso from Fiocruz. And so I met her because she was kind of same age or even younger than me. And I met her, and I once said, okay, maybe she doesn't work anymore with cholera. She works with malaria and so on. And so I asked her, well, you don't work anymore with cholera because you are famous for your model. I said, yeah, okay, there's no cholera in Brazil. Because, and then she said, well, why? And I said, well, actually, it just got away because improvement of sanitary conditions, and there's no cholera. More access to water that is free of it's treated and can be safely consumed, and so cholera disappeared. Right? But you see, for instance, cholera is also, for instance, where do you find cholera? Well, there in Southeastern Asia, that's, and in Haiti. In Haiti, what happened? There was no cholera actually, right? But then you had this famous earthquake that almost destroyed everything there, and there's also the infrastructure coming, and then there were these Peace Corps that because it was also involved with internal fightings, and so there were Peace Corps coming from where? From Southeast Asia, and without the infrastructure to have the water treated and so on, you had an emergence of cholera epidemic. Okay, so more. Okay, there. Okay. Already. You have to hold it.
Related to the predation model, what about if there's a species that its only predator is humans? Can I use the human population in this model? And also, I wonder if this model can be used for endemic species.
In?
Endemic species.
Endemic species, yeah. So, humans. So, we have a very diversified diet. So the human population does not depend on a certain specific prey. Okay? It could be vegetal or animal. So it's usually it is very diversified, at least in modern times. So no big point about predator-prey dynamics in this case, because we are so generalist that and so adaptive, because what we never see here in population dynamics is that species could adapt the behavioral modifications due to excess or of food, or just not enough nutrients. There could be behavioral changes, and this is difficult to take into account in population dynamics models. Okay? But we know it's important, for instance, in COVID. Okay, so if you remember well, at the very beginning, there were estimates of how many people could die in US if nothing were done. 2 million. And then this guy, actually, is a guy that's very famous, and Neil Ferguson. He's coming actually in July here, and was criticized that your predictions were wrong. Were not wrong. If nothing would have no action by either government or by people, then you could have a very catastrophic situation, but people adapt either through governmental, or either people just, I stay home because I'm afraid. Okay? So this adaptation is what is very important in the case of epidemiology when you have an epidemic. And this can also happen in with species, in predator-prey relations and so on. And in fact, humans are very adaptable and not dependent on a single species, or there are so many things that human dynamics is not. It's kind of almost single species dynamics. Okay, it's more. It would be an example of kind of single species. There's actually There are predators, which are the pathogens, but it's very different. It's a host pathogen system and so on. And then so many diversity of nutrients that, well, it's like there's always nutrients, okay? At least, say, in modern times. And second part, what was the
can I use endemic species in this model?
Yeah, I mean, endemic species, endemic species are just species that are the natural species of a certain place, and yeah, you can have this. And usually, what is this? You have a certain situation. Usually, more or less, there's a tendency to have over time constant populations. Okay? So the species are actually endemic there, and so on, and this is could be explained by predator-prey relations, but with a fixed point, as we saw yesterday. A fixed point. But sometimes it's very interesting that you have this situation, which is a kind of equilibrium when you have an invasive species. Invasive species may change very much the dynamics of the endemic species if you have an invasion. That's why invasions are so much studied, and actually people try to avoid having invasions, but at the end you always have some. Okay? But for instance, this is a case where you could have, say, these two here without the cat here as coexisting, and an invasion changes everything, changes it. That could be. More questions? General questions. Doesn't need to be predator-prey competition. General questions. There and then there.
So I was thinking of works that are carried out periodically in
birds?
No, periodically in the same place, like in fauna surveys and conservation units. I was thinking if generally it has a variation in the number of the individuals of a species, but I would like to know if that would be a way to estimate the carrying capacity of a species. And I also would like you to explain again about the shared carrying capacity of a population with several species, because I don't...
Oh, okay, so I mean, if you don't take anything out and the dynamics is simple, we'll go to the carrying capacity. Okay, so you just get there, and how much. When you take out, what you are, that's called mathematically a system which has pulses. Okay, because you either you can put or take out, and this drives usually some periodicity if you do it periodically to the system, but it's not connected to the carrying capacity. About shared carrying capacity, what I was discussing at the beginning was not a shared carrying capacity. I mean, it was not two species. It was, usually you would say, it's, for instance, the same species with structure, okay? So the resource is the same, okay? For instance, if you have males and females, okay? You could have a carrying capacity that depends only on the sum of males and females because they have the same behavior with respect to resource consumption. Then actually the resources are shared, and if they both prey on the resources more or less in the same rate, then you can just have a carrying capacity for the total population. And now, when you have different species, maybe maybe they have shared resource or not, or maybe they have different resources, and then in this case you will have carrying capacities for each of them. Right? And that's it. Then it's not anymore shared. Okay? So the carrying capacity, it will depend on what you are actually looking for. Okay? If you are looking for structure population, maybe the carrying capacity is the same. It's just one single carrying capacity for the population. Whereas sometimes it could be different. If, for instance, a certain class consumes resources in a very different way than the other class, then you have to have, for instance, if we had hypothetically, say, males consume a certain resource, but females prefer different resources, and then in this case you have two carrying capacities, okay? Because they have different resource consumption. But if the resource consumption is very similar, then you have only one carrying capacity.
Is there any ecological model that you like for any reason? Like
so, an ecological, actually, I like the Rosenzweig-McCarter because it's nice, because it has cycles and has fixed points, and you can play with it. And so it's a nice thing. I'm talking about the simple things. There are other models that. What I have done most of the time with respect to ecology is spatial ecology, which we won't study here. But there are very nice things that there's a model called the Fisher-Kolmogorov equation, which is it's just a logistic plus the effect of diffusion. And this is a very nice equation. I will write it down. So if you don't understand pretty much the math, it's just illustrative. I don't mean that you should actually study this. But for instance, the Fisher-Kolmogorov equation is for the density of a certain species. Okay? Not the total number of individuals, but the density in space. Number of individuals per area. Okay? And usually that's called rho. And this can depend on the place and on the time. Okay? So it does not depend only on time. And usually the equation that describes the simplest case is this. Plus something is usually written this, second derivative rho. And you have a function of two variables. You can take the derivative with respect to time or with respect to the other one, x. Okay? So this notation is partial derivative. Okay? Because if you have a function that depends, say, on x and t, then you would say, what's the derivative of the function? And you say, yeah, derivative in respect to x or in respect to t. So you can have both. Okay? And so this is the equation called Fisher-Kolmogorov equation, or sometimes also called the Fisher-Kolmogorov-Piskunov and Petrovsky-Piskunov, FKPP equation. And this equation has the property that here, if you put here rho, and here you put x, and you start with a certain population concentrated in a certain place, then what happens that is this over time will get like this, and after a longer time it will be just like this, and this goes traveling this way, and this goes traveling this way. Okay, so where you have something that's called a traveling front, and this is, has been important in spatial at the very beginning of the spatial dynamics of species, as this has been studied by a person that is very important in spatial dynamics, which is Skellum. Skellum is important guy, and back in the 60s, I think. And there's this case of the introduction of muskrats in the city of Prague in Czech Republic. And muskrats are valuable for the fur, and they are native to America, and so they were hunted, and so a guy with kinds of commercial intention, let's have the muskrat here. I don't have to go to US. Okay, okay, but for some they escape it, or the business just didn't go as expected, and so they fled, and they have been observed the area where you have the muskrat over like 10 years, okay? And so you see this thing expanding, the range where you have the muskrat expanding, and Skellum showed that it's actually this range expanded at constant time, at constant velocity. So it was expanding with constant velocity, which has to do with this kind of equation. So this is if you had only this here, which is pure diffusion, then you don't have constant velocity. Okay? You have decaying velocity. But I saw that actually it's a constant. So this is a typical problem of spatial dynamics. Okay? So this equation is also a very nice equation.
I have a question about the predator-prey model. It would be possible or would be relevant in a situation that we have a carrying capacity for the predator? Because theoretically, the prey is what regulates the population of the predator. But let's say in a situation where the environment does not give abundance of all the necessities the predator needs aside from food. For instance, refuge or other types of resources. Could we add a K to the model for this? Okay. Or would this be included, for instance, I forgot the name, but there was one equation that considered another thing for the predator that I forgot.
in competition or no?
Yes, interspecific.
Yeah.
Interspecific.
So, yeah, if your predator is not a specialist and has several nutrients, right, several prey, then you could say, well, I'm studying a particular prey, maybe the one that's very important, okay, the preferred one. But, well, maybe the predator also needs some other nutrients, which you don't want to model explicitly. You could go on modeling, okay, it needs water, it needs whatever, it's other, and put everything there, and never talk about the carrying capacity. But maybe you don't have enough information about all the resources. Then you got back to the situation like with the logistic. Okay, the logistic has a carrying capacity. Why? Because there are resources, but I don't model the resources, and then just have a carrying capacity. Therefore, if you have a generalist predator, and you have only information about, say, one of the preys, and not on the other nutrients, then you can have a carrying capacity for the predator, okay? Because maybe the predator needs certain nutrients, but you are not modeling them. Because, you know, models are like this. To be useful, a model should not be as complicated as the nature itself, because then you are not, not getting anything. So usually when you have this kind of consumer resources or predator-prey dynamics, you have to, at a certain point, you have to stop. Okay? For instance, we have stopped saying we don't model the resources of the prey because, well, obviously the prey also has resources and so on, and you will go back to very low trophic levels and so on, very complicated thing. So you have, let's simplify, say there's a carrying capacity. Now, maybe also could happen that the predator is a generalist, and then I could have to go on and writing lots of equations for all the possible resources and say, no, there is one resource that I actually can, the prey that I can measure and I can study, the other ones are difficult, so let's create a carrying capacity for the predator. Okay? Then it's both, it's regulated bottom up the predator, but there are two kinds of regulation. One is explicit prey, the other one is all other factors that affect the consumption of the predator. Yeah, so I think one last one. 5 minutes. So I'm waiting. Yeah. Mike. You have your own mic.
Well, we talked about parasitoid, and I want to know how does a parasite, because I have in my mind that a parasite must keep its prey alive so it can live on, and I want to understand how we can model this kind of system.
Parasite or parasitoid?
Parasite.
Parasite. Well, you will have population of hosts and parasites, and the host will be a resource which will ultimately define a kind of carrying capacity for the parasite, right? So just one parasite and one host will not be very fun. I mean, it will be just if the parasite, well, let's say the parasite has some effect on the host. That's what will determine the kind of model. If it's just a parasite that has no effect on the birth rate or death rate of the host, then the host is just it's just a resource. I mean, just infinite resource, or creates a carrying capacity in a number of hosts that you have. But if the parasite affects your the behavior or the birth and death rates, then you can have a more complicated dynamics, but there will be models like with differential equations, and you could have things like threshold values, for instance. If the parasite is not very, I mean, maybe it's a parasite that only has effects on the host if it is in large numbers, for instance. Now, one thing that you can, it's not exactly parasite, but it's like crop pests. Okay, it's usually not more or less like a parasite. Okay, if you have insects that consume your plantations or your trees and so on, so it's more or less connected to this, and yeah, if something does not affect the host, then it's just a carrying capacity. But if it affects the host, then there can be many things that are interesting. Right? So there are cases where, yeah, that there is even parasites that are able to manipulate the host, and make them change the behavior in a way that ultimately will favor the parasite, so on. I don't have any. I know this is possible, but I can't now remember a system that has the manipulative parasites. But it's something which is interesting.
There's a fungi, actually a group of fungi called entomopathogenic fungi, which modulates the behavior of the host to go like to a upper place and put in like upwards, and then it shoots its reproductive body, and then it kills the host and shoots its reproductive body and shoots spores. So it could be an example.
Could be.
I think my point is that we cannot use a predator-prey classic model to...
No, not a predator-prey classic model. No, because if it, unless it kills them. But this would be host parasite systems that, these are, I don't know exactly why, but they are more studied with discrete time, with generational times, not continuous time usually. And there are hosts, I even have a book that's called Host Parasite Dynamics, and everything is in discrete time. Okay? I think it was Hassel book. And yeah, you have different models. It's not like the predator-prey thing. It is a relation that can be sometimes antagonistic, but it's a little bit different. Yeah. So, okay, it's 10:30. That's it. So next steps will be consumer resource dynamics, and this what we want to do. The next step is to have a better description of competition. Our competition was totally phenomenological. There's those constant that are the competitive forces and so on, which are kind of ugly, and we want to see if we can do better. So, for instance, consider 2 species and 1 resource, and see what happens. Okay, and this is competition studied mechanistically and non-phenomenologically. It is not very difficult. It just has more species. We have 3 species. But we will see it's not very difficult. And we also want to understand better how a carrying capacity emerges from a mechanistic model. So it's a kind of thing that is the more modern competition theory, which is based on consumer resource dynamics and not phenomenological. So this is the next step, and then after that we will have learned how to work with 3-dimensional, 3 species, and we will have also, I think I will develop at least 1 example of a community modulus, which is intragill predation. Okay. And then after this we go to epidemiology. That will be the last week. Okay, so that's it. Thank you.